Okay, friends, another new section today. We're going to pick up at Matthew 16, verse 13 to 20. This is a very famous passage of Jesus where Jesus is seen to ask his disciples the absolutely vital question, which is, who do you say I am? Okay, so let's look at the text and see if there's any sort of a discovery or insight that is gained by any of the disciples here. So picking up at verse 13, it tells us, when Jesus came into the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asks his disciples, who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? So they said, some say John the Baptist, some Elijah, and others Jeremiah, or one of the other prophets. But he said to them, this is Jesus talking, but who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered and said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. So here we have the story again, picking up at a point where Jesus, in a sense, has made yet another withdrawal from the wider society, or certainly removed himself out of the place he'd previously been. Now, what's worth noting here is that this is the beginning, if you like, of the end of Jesus' ministry. You can see the sort of horizon of the end of this aspect of his teaching and miraculous ministry beginning to draw near. And it would seem that Jesus, again, he really needed and wanted to spend time alone with his disciples. And this was a way he was able to do it. He still had an awful lot to say to them, and certainly a lot to still teach them. And this is because, as we shall find, and we have found all along, that there were some things they just did not seem able to hear or did not want to hear. And there were some things that some of them just did not seem to understand, not yet anyway. So to that end, he is seen here to withdraw to the district of what's called Caesarea Philippi. Now, Caesarea Philippi lay about 25 miles northeast of the Sea of Galilee. It's important to note that it was outside the authority of Herod Antipas. Now, he was the guy who was ruler of Galilee at that time and the one who had ordered the beheading of John the Baptist. They're still within the area of control of Philip the Tetrarch, but the population in this area was mainly non-Jewish. Some Bible experts say they believed Jesus withdrew to this area because he would probably have more time and peace, time to teach the 12 who were still following him. The key guys, as it were, these 12 apostles. You see, we're getting to the point where the days of his incarnation, of him being in the flesh, they were numbered. And there was a problem in a sense that not even his closest disciples fully understood who he was and what this meant yet. In fact, it would be reasonable to ask the question, was there really anyone yet who fully understood him for who and what he was? And if that's the case, this was a crucial problem, for it involved the very survival of the Christian faith and the message of God given and outworked through him, and its survival after he'd gone. If there were none amongst this inner group who had grasped the truth, or even were on the way to grasping it, then all the work that had been done so far could be undone. All he needed was a few core people to realize the truth, and he would know that the work of God and the plan of God was safe. So Jesus was determined to put his followers in these verses to a test, if you like, and ask them and try and find out who they really believed him to be. He had had multiple evidence as he went along the way that they hadn't fully got it yet. They were growing in their faith and their insight, but they weren't quite there yet. Experts believe it is of great significance to recognize the significance of not just the question that Jesus chose to ask, but also why he chose to ask it in this district. You see, there would be few districts that would have more religious associations than Caesarea Philippi. This area was scattered with temples, mainly of the ancient Syrian god Baal, the place where Baal worship would have been carried out, an appalling type of worship that involved the sacrifice of children at Asherah poles. And in this area there were no fewer than 14 temples dedicated solely to the worship of Baal. And they were based particularly in the area that Jesus is in. This is an area where the culture of these ancient, awful pagan religions still held sway and were rife. It would have been seeped into the very atmosphere and culture of that town. They would be literally standing in the shadow of the temples and the statues of various ancient gods, including Baal. But not only the Syrian gods were worshipped there. Caesarea Philippi was built upon a large hill, and at the base of the hill there was a cave with a deep cavern in it, and that cavern was said to be the birthplace of the Greek god Pan. So there was much going on here with Caesarea Philippi, and it was identified as not only the place of worship of these pagan gods, but also as the original place in which Pan came from. Its original name was actually Panis before it was changed to Caesarea Philippi. And to this day, this place is now, we call the town there today Banis, which is a reference back to the name Panis, the name that was given as the birthplace of Pan. But the legend of Pan also suggested that that place, that cave with the lake in it, was the source of the River Jordan. It's where it came to life. But there's even more to it than that. In Caesarea Philippi, at that time, when Jesus and the disciples visited, there was a great temple of white marble, and it was built to Caesar in his position as a god. This place was remarkably important to the Roman religious system. It is there they erected this temple, which was dedicated to Caesar. In fact, Roman historian Josephus, writing about this area, describes the temple as being huge, built of white marble, with matching fountains down to the River Jordan. The place it is situated, he said, and identified it as Paneum. He says, where there is a top of a mountain of immense height, and inside it and beneath a dark cave opens itself within, and within that cave there is a horrible precipice, I'm quoting his words now, that descends abruptly to a vast depth. It contains a mighty quantity of water which is immovable, and when anyone has tried to let themselves down or let anything down to measure the depth of the earth beneath the water, no length of cord has been found sufficient to reach it. So that's quoting from Josephus talking about this area. So although originally called Panis and the birthplace of Pan by those who followed Greek gods, later we see Herod's son Philip come along and in his way try and beautify and enrich the whole temperate area, and it was he who changed the name of the town from Panis to Caesarea, which means Caesar's town, named after the temple, but then he added his own name, Philippi, at the end to sort of try and get a bit of glory by association. No one who would come to and visit Caesarea Philippi, or even just look at it from a distance, would not see it as this town of pagan worship and the worship of the Roman gods, if nothing else for the massive glistening marble temple on the top of the hill. No one in Jesus' day would think anything else that this was a town dedicated to the divinity of Rome. Yet it is into this situation and this background that a young, effectively penniless rabbi teacher appears with his 12 very ordinary followers. Now remember, at this very same moment, the religious hierarchy, the Jewish religious hierarchy, are plotting and planning to destroy him, as they would describe him as an alleged heretic, one who's doing what he's doing by the power of Beelzebub. And here he goes, and they're standing in an area that's littered with temples to the Syrian gods, in a place where the ancient gods were said to look down, and in a place where the history of Israel crowded in as well, because it had been recognized as the source of the River Jordan. And yet all the while, this huge white marble temple built to Caesar worship. And all of that is dominating the town and the landscape around him. And it is in this place that Jesus now stands, and he asks his disciples, again, using the situation around him, he says, look at all this. Who do you think I am? Who do you think the people believe I am? And he's actually asking them, do they recognize that he is the Messiah, the Son of God, the Son of the one true God Most High? As Greek historian William Barclay wrote, it is as if Jesus deliberately set himself against the background of all the world religions at that time and throughout all history, and he put himself in a place of their highest splendor, and he demanded that his followers compare themselves to him and ask them to give a verdict in his favor. Some have said that there are few examples of where Jesus' awareness of his own importance, his own deity, in fact, shines out more clearly than it does here when he asks those who are following him to make a decision about him. And by nature, I believe, as disciples or as anybody who follows him and reads the text today, he is also demanding of us to make that decision also. So it is here, in this place at Caesarea Philippi, that Jesus demands a verdict from his followers. He must know where they stand, and he must know that before he sets out towards Jerusalem, because he knows he's heading towards the cross. And if they've really, or at least some of them have really grasped who he is and what's going on, then he knows the work and plans of God are safely delivered. Yet, also, notice he doesn't ask the question directly, does he? He leads up to it. He begins by asking his disciples what the crowds were saying about him and who they took him to be. And he gets various answers, doesn't he? Some say that, the crowd said he was John the Baptist, which is worth noting that Herod Antipas was not the only man who felt that John the Baptist had come back from the dead. Others say that he was Elijah. Now, in saying that, in doing that, they were saying two things about Jesus. First, they were saying that he was as great as the greatest of all the prophets. For Elijah had always been looked on as the high point of the prophetic line in the minds of the Jewish people at that time. So they were at least acknowledging Jesus as at least the forerunner of the Messiah. As Malachi said in the close of the Old Testament, he talked about the promise of God and said, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes." That's Malachi 4 verse 5. And to this day, in fact, the Jews expect the return of Elijah before the becoming of the Messiah. And even today, they leave a chair vacant for Elijah at the table whenever a family celebrate the Passover, because they know that when Elijah comes, the Messiah will not be far behind. So it would seem that some of the people looked on Jesus and they saw him, if not as the Messiah themselves, as the herald of the Messiah and as the forerunner of the direct intervention of God, but clearly not seeing him yet as the actual Messiah himself. Jesus' disciples also said that some of them appeared to say that Jesus was Jeremiah. Now that's a little bit trickier to unpack, because Jeremiah had a rather curious place in the expectations of the people of Israel at that time. It was believed and recorded in the Jewish apocryphal writings, the extra-biblical texts, the texts that didn't make it into the canon of Scripture, but there were still writings that said that before the people went into exile, Jeremiah had taken the ark and the altar and the incense out of the temple, and he'd hidden them in a lonely cave in Mount Nebo. And that before the coming of the Messiah, that Jeremiah would return and produce these items again, enabling the glory of God to come back to the people again. And Jeremiah was therefore seen as a forerunner of the coming of the Messiah, and in a sense, someone coming in a country's time of help and trouble. So when these people in the crowds were identifying Jesus with Elijah and with Jeremiah, they were, according to their thinking, in fact paying him a compliment and setting him in a high place, for Jeremiah and Elijah were indeed recognized as the expected forerunners of the Anointed One of God. When they arrived, they believed that meant the kingdom of God was near indeed. Maybe not at hand, but certainly getting near. So having heard from his disciples what they said the crowd believed who they thought he was, then he turns to the disciples themselves and asks that all-important question, "And who do you say I am?" And it is Peter who is seen to speak up first and make his famous great declaration. He says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Now, hearing this, I believe that Jesus would have known that indeed his work was safe, because there was at least one of his group who fully understood who he was. As an aside, it's interesting to note that in each of the three Gospels, it has its own slight variation of the version of Peter replying to this question. Matthew has him saying, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Mark simply says, and everything Mark says is very stripped down and simple. He just simply says, you are the Christ. And Luke sort of sits in the middle and says, you are the Christ of God. Jesus knew by this answer now at least someone amongst his followers now fully recognized him as the Messiah, the anointed one of God, the Son of the living God. Now, this word Messiah and this word Christ, used in these various accounts of Peter's reply, they actually mean the same thing. One is just Hebrew and the other is Greek, and the terms just mean the anointed one. Kings were ordained to office by anointing in those days. Well, in fact, they still are. Okay, we shall see that, in fact, and that's what will happen to King Charles here in the UK in May 2023, when he is anointed at a crowning ceremony at Westminster Abbey in May of this year. But here it's saying this is the Messiah, the Christ, the anointed one. But of course, for Jesus, he's not being anointed just as an authority over a region or a town or even a country. He's being anointed as God's king over all men and women on earth. Essentially, Peter has discovered and is expressing something here that everyone who ever wonders who Jesus is needs to grasp hold of and make a decision about. And that is, he recognizes, first of all, that these human categories, even though they are respectful and they are the highest in effect that people in worldly terms could think of, they are inadequate descriptions of who Jesus Christ really is. You see, when the people described Jesus as Elijah or Jeremiah or one of the prophets, they thought they were probably putting him in the highest category they can think of. Remember way back when we did the overview of Malachi back in season 1 of this podcast adventure? We did it as a sort of an introduction. We did each of the books of the Bible in about 6 minutes to do an introduction to the whole project. During the time we looked at Malachi, we discovered that it was the belief of the Jews at that time that since the close of Malachi, in other words, for over 400 years, the voice of prophecy had been silent. So these people were in fact saying that Jesus had come to the people, and once again through him they could hear the direct, authentic voice of God for the first time in nearly half a millennium. So these were great tributes in an earthly way, but they were still not good enough or great enough to describe who Jesus actually was. And Peter discovered here that there was in fact no human categorization which you could apply to Jesus to adequately describe who Jesus Christ really was. It's also interesting to note that most people who approach this would point out the fact that Peter, because of his background, remember he was just an ordinary fisherman, he could never have given a theological account or a philosophical explanation of what he meant when he said and declared that Jesus was the Son of the living God. But the one thing with which Peter was certain of, that he had understood that there was no merely human description that was adequate in order to describe him. You couldn't compare him or put him in a line of ordinary mortal men or women. And this passage here, and Peter in his response, reminds me that our discovery, or anyone's discovery of Jesus Christ, must always be a personal discovery. Salvation does not lie within the organization or the religion. It lies in recognizing and discovering who Jesus is for yourself. Jesus' question, the question he asked, is a personal one. Who do you think I am? He said. Do you remember, maybe you're aware later, Pilate will ask him the same thing. He'll ask him if he's king of the Jews. And Jesus' answer was, who do you say I am? Or are you just repeating what you have heard others say about me? That's in John chapter 18. Our answer to that question, our acknowledgement of who we think Jesus might be, must never be a second-hand verdict. Someone might have studied the Bible for years. They might know every thought and every verdict passed on Jesus. They might even know every theological argument about him and know all about the great minds of history and what they've come up with. They might even be able to give a competent summary of Jesus' teachings or about what every great Christian thinker and theologian has said about him. They can know all those things, but they still might not be a Christian. Christianity never consists of just knowing things about Jesus. It always consists of first knowing him. Jesus Christ demands a personal response, a personal verdict to who you say he is. And it appears to me that if you look at this passage closely and consider the way it's worded, he not only asks this question on that day of Peter, but if you read it closely, I believe he asks it to every one of his disciples. Everyone who says or strives to be a follower of him, he asks that very profound question to which we must have an answer, which is, who do you say I am? Okay, friends, as I said, picking up exactly where we left off last time, which is this conversation between Jesus and his disciples in the area of geographically located at Caesarea Philippi, talking initially to the disciples, but now narrowing it down to just Peter, where he makes this, is it a commission, is it a promise? Well, let's read it together and see what it says. So remember, he's just asked the disciples, who do you think I am? And Peter is the one who speaks up and says, you are the Messiah, the Son of God. And then Peter replies and answers him, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, because flesh and blood has not revealed this unto you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will remain bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will remain loosed in heaven. Now, many would recognize this passage as one of the great passages of the New Testament. However, it is also one of the passages that has caused the most difficulty. It's historically been a very difficult passage for people to approach without prejudice. And that's probably because it's been used by the Roman Catholic Church as the foundation of their position of the Pope as being the head of the Church. This passage is taken by most in the Roman Catholic Church to mean that to Peter were given the keys which would admit or exclude any individual from heaven. And it also was given to him the power to absolve or not to absolve an individual of their sins. Now, it's further argued by some in the Roman Catholic Church that Peter held these tremendous rights and therefore became the first bishop of Rome, and that power has descended to all the bishops of Rome that have existed ever since and down to this day. So, in other words, that authority lies with whoever is chosen as the Pope for the current generation. It doesn't take you to think about that for very long to see how impossible that doctrine is for anybody who's a non-Catholic believer. And it's also to see how Protestant and Catholic believers tend to approach this passage with a certain degree of entrenched ideas, and maybe one might say prejudice, rather than just approaching it with a blank slate and a genuine desire to be open to discover what is its true and main meaning. Well, first of all here, we have to say there is absolutely a play on words going on here. Peter the rock, he's described as. Now, in Greek, Peter is Petros, and the word rock is Petra. And even Peter's Aramaic name, which was Cephas, also was the word that was Aramaic for rock. So in either language, in whatever way you look at it, we have a play on words here. And this play on words is used immediately after he makes his great discovery where he declares who Jesus is. He has just said, you are Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And then Christ's immediate reply to that is, he says, and you are Petrus, and on this Petra I will build my church. Whatever else this word means, it is certainly a word that was meant to be a great encouragement to Peter. The rabbis of that time also took this word and applied it to Abraham, and they said, look unto the rock from whence we are hewn. And as descendants of Abraham, Abraham was the rock upon which the nation and the purpose of God were founded and embodied in the nation of Israel. It's also worth noting that this word rock is used again and again in the Old Testament and applied to God himself. For example, he is the rock and his work is perfect, is heard in Deuteronomy 32:4, and there is no rock like our God, 1 Samuel 2:2. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, 2 Samuel 22:2. And then from Psalms, who is the rock except our God? Psalm 18:31. So one thing is very clear here. To call anyone a rock in those days was a great compliment, and no Jew who knew his Old Testament to any level could ever hear or use that phrase without his thoughts turning to God, who alone was the true rock of that person's salvation. So what then did Jesus mean when in this passage he uses the word rock and applies it to Peter? Well, to that question, I believe there are 4 answers that you can give, and they're not mutually exclusive. Augustine took the rock to mean Jesus himself. It's as if Jesus said, "You, Peter, and on myself, as the rock, as God, I will found my church. And the days will come when, as a reward for your faith, you will have great responsibility and authority in the church, but also you will be greatly remembered in the church's history." Now, a second explanation is that the rock simply stands for the truth, the fact that Jesus Christ himself is the Son of the living God. And we have just seen here to Peter that that great truth had just been divinely revealed to him and expressed by him. The fact that Jesus Christ is the Son of God is, of course, the main foundation stone of the church's faith, and belief in that truth is undeniable and unquestionable if you wish to be part establishing anything that would declare that faith and truth. Now, a third explanation is that the rock in some way stands for Peter's faith himself, because on the faith of Peter, the first apostle to express the full deity of Christ, is the rock upon which the church is founded. So in the sense that his faith was the spark which was to kindle the faith of the worldwide church. It was his initial impetus which brought about the worldwide community of faith of those who have been called by faith to be followers of Christ. And the last interpretation is my most favoured, but let me just add again that it doesn't mean that it's mutually exclusive to the others. All of these can very well be seen as true. But my most favoured interpretation, the core, the main one I believe, is that the rock is of course God itself, because that ties in with how that phrase would have been used and extrapolated out of the Old Testament by any Jewish person at that time. You see, Peter was the first person on earth to fully understand who Jesus was and his relationship to the Old Testament. He was the first to make that huge leap of faith and see in Jesus the Son of the living God, the Messiah in flesh, incarnated. In other words, Peter was the first member of the church, and in that sense the whole church is built upon him because others follow after him. And in the ages to come, everyone who makes the same discovery as Peter is in a sense is just another stone added to this pictorial edifice, this metaphor of the edifice of the Church of Christ on earth. Here Peter is the foundation, but in the sense that he is the one person, the first person upon this whole church, this whole community of faith, this whole group of people who will make the same declaration that he did and recognize Jesus in the same way that he did, and he was simply the first human being, the first man to discover who Jesus really was. In Ephesians 2 verse 20, Paul writes, the prophets and the apostles are said to be the foundation of the church, and it is on their work and their witness and on their devotion that the church on earth, humanly speaking, depends. And that doesn't contradict what's going on here. And in fact, in the same passage, Jesus Christ is said not only to be the rock, but he's said to be the chief cornerstone. In other words, he's the force, the person who holds the church together. Without him, the whole edifice would disintegrate and collapse. In 1 Peter, Peter himself writing, verses 4 to 8, he describes all Christians as living stones, who, upon their faith, are built into the fabric of the church. It's very clear to see that the New Testament writers throughout the whole New Testament took the picture of the church community as a building, and they used it as a metaphor for the community of faith, for the body of believers. But they used it in many ways. But at the back of the idea was always the idea that Jesus was the real first foundation stone upon which the church was built, and he is the only power and the only one who actually, in that sense, holds the church together. And what Jesus is saying to Peter here is that on him he would found his church that was established through faith in him. He did not mean that the church depended on Peter in any way, but that it depended first on him himself, on God himself, the rock. But it did mean that the church would begin with Peter, in the sense that Peter is, in that sense, the foundation of the church. And that is a unique honour, a special honour and a special position that he holds. And no Catholic, or Protestant for that matter, can ever take that away from him. The second point to bear in mind here, which is very important, is the word used for church here is ecclesia. Now, very often when we see the word church in the New Testament, it can convey something of a wrong impression. We are very inclined to think today of churches as institutions, organizations, buildings even, things with offices, services, meetings going on. But the word that Jesus used here was ecclesia, or in Aramaic gahal, which is the word the Old Testament used for the congregation of believers, the gathering of the people of the Lord. Wherever they came together, there was ecclesia. Therefore, what Jesus is saying to Peter here is, Peter, you are the beginning of this new community of people of the Lord, the new fellowship of those who believe in my name. And Peter is the first of this new fellowship of believers in Christ. So it's not about a church in an institutional sense, still less about any church in what we would today call a denominational sense. This is something, a community that began with Peter. Which began with Peter was a fellowship of all who declared belief and faith in Jesus Christ. And it was not a community that identified with any particular building or any single synagogue, and was not limited to any single place, but embraced everyone who declared they loved the Lord and accepted him as the Messiah, the Saviour of their sins. Therefore, what we can say about the first part of this controversial passage is that it means that Peter is the foundation stone of the church, in the sense that he is the first of the great fellowship of people who joyfully declare their own personal discovery that Jesus Christ is Lord. But in the ultimate sense, it is God himself who is the rock upon which this family of believers, which we today call the church, is established. But then it goes on to say this other extra added phrase, which again causes much consternation and controversy. He tells Peter that the gates of hell shall not prevail against his church. Now, the idea of gates prevailing is not a natural or an easy metaphor for us to understand today. For many, it will call the image to mind of a fortress. And that suggestion does find support in the fact that the location where Jesus is teaching these things here is on the top of a mountain overlooking Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus was based. This is where he's having this conversation with the disciples, and at that place stood a great castle we already discovered, which would have been in its full glory at that time. And maybe again Jesus is simply using the location he's in to create an image of the church as being like a fortress, and the forces of evil being like an opposing army laying siege to a fortress, and saying that the power of that evil will never prevail against his church. Also, it's worth noting that in the ancient Middle East at that time, the gate was the place, especially in towns and villages, where the elders and the rulers of the community met, and they dispensed counsel, wise counsel, and justice. Anyone with a problem would be told to go to the city gate and speak to the elders. So the gates came to represent the place of local government. So then the phrase can also be seen to mean that the powers and principalities, the very government of hell, so to speak, will never prevail against his church. But there's another idea we can throw in the mix here. If we go back and connect it to the idea that this is the rock upon which the church is founded, and it is the conviction that Jesus is none other than the Son of the living God, then the one person to whom the gates of Hades, the gates of hell, could not contain was, of course, Jesus Christ. He rose again on the third day. He broke the bounds of death. As the writer of the Acts to the Apostles put it, it was not possible for him to be held by death. Thou wilt not abandon my soul to Hades, nor let the Holy One see corruption. Acts 2:27 tells us. This indeed may be a triumphant reference being used here by Jesus and said to Peter, and is nothing less than a declaration of his coming resurrection. Jesus may very well just be saying to him, you've discovered that I am the Son of the living God, but the time will come when I will be crucified, but yet the gates of hell will close behind me, but they will remain powerless to shut me in. Even the gates of hell have no power against me, over me, because I am the Son of the living God. But however we take it, whether one interpretation or both or all of them, in this phrase, Jesus triumphantly expresses the indestructibility of even death to rob him of who he is, and the indestructibility of his church that will follow on. So let's close by just thinking a minute about the place of Peter in the historic church. We've come, and there are two phrases at the end which describe certain privileges which are given to him and certain duties which are laid upon Peter. He said to Peter that he has given him the keys of the kingdom. And this is obviously a difficult phrase for those of us of a Protestant tradition to hold or to interpret. But we do well to begin with by establishing the things about this phrase, this expression, of which we can be sure. The phrase always signified about holding the keys, always signifies some sort of special power or authority or responsibility. In the New Testament, this phrase is regularly attached to Jesus. We are told it is in his hands and no one else's that the keys are held. In Revelation chapter 1 verse 18, it tells us that upon the return of Christ, the risen Christ will say, I am the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and Hades. So it appears to me that what Jesus is saying to Peter is that in the days to come, you are going to be my steward of the kingdom. And in the case of Peter, the whole idea is that of opening, not shutting the door of the kingdom. That would soon become absolutely true, because we will see shortly at Pentecost, Peter does indeed open the door to 3,000 souls in one sermon in Acts 2:41. And he is also will be seen to open the door to the Gentile world through the centurion Cornelius, because after his conversion, thereafter it is open to the whole Gentile world, we're told in Acts chapter 10. Acts 15 tells us how the Council of Jerusalem opened the door wide for the Gentiles, and how it was Peter's witness to that council that made that possible. Acts 15. You see, the promise that Peter would have the keys to the kingdom was the promise that Peter would follow on with the means by which the door to God would be open for thousands and thousands of people in the days that followed. In other words, through the preaching and the declaration of the gospel. But it is not only Peter who has the keys to the kingdom. Thereafter, every Christian that follows him has them as well. For it is for every one of us to open the door of the kingdom to other people, and so to enter also into that great promise of Christ first made to the first believer, Peter. Jesus further promised Peter that what he bound would remain bound, and what he loosened would remain loosened. Now, theologian Richard Glover, I think, is very helpful in this, because he takes this to mean that Peter would lay people's sin before them and bind them to their consequences. In other words, that they would have their sins presented, and they would have the opportunity to let them loose and be free of them, of their sins, by telling them of the love and the forgiveness of God in the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's an amazing thought. And in my mind, that means that such a duty, as fell on Peter, falls on every Christian, every preacher, every teacher, or evangelist, or just anyone who's a Christian. That responsibility falls upon us as even just a friend, to draw people's attention to how they are bound up in sin and show them how they can be set free, be loosed from that sin. To this phrase, to loose and to bind, were very common Jewish phrases at that time. To bind simply meant to declare something forbidden. In other words, to lay it out as something that was wrong, to declare and illuminate the difference between right and wrong, and to loose was to declare it aloud, or to declare that someone is free of it. So what Jesus is saying here to Peter is, Peter, you're going to have the initial grave and heavy responsibility laid upon you, and you are going to be the one who will have to make the decisions that will affect the welfare of this newly birthed church. This duty, if you like, of binding and loosening meant that Peter would have to take decisions about the early church's life and the practice of the individuals in it, which would have very far-reaching consequences into how it was established into the future. And indeed, we read throughout the earlier chapters of Acts that what we see in Jerusalem is exactly what is going on and what Peter did at that time. When we study this passage closely, a passage which has caused so much argument and controversy over the years, we can see that what it's dealing with is not organizations, it's not dealing with institutional churches or religious hierarchies, but with the things of salvation. And Jesus saying to Peter, your name means rock, and your destiny is to be a rock, means that you're the first man to recognize me for who I am, what I am, and therefore you're going to be the first stone in the editorship and the organization and the outworking of that community of fellowship of those who will subsequently belong to me. You will have to stand up for that fellowship. You will have to stand up for it against the embattled powers of evil, but know that no one will prevail against it. And in the days to come, you will be the one who will unlock the doors of the kingdom, not just to Jews, but to Gentiles also. And also, Peter, your role, he's telling him, is to guide and help and solve the problems and direct the work of this infant and growing fellowship of believers, this thing we today call the worldwide church. You see, Peter was the first to make the discovery as to who Jesus really was, to fully make that discovery. And because of that, Peter was given both great privilege and great responsibility. But yet it is a discovery which everyone must make for themselves. And when they make it, the same privileges and responsibilities are now laid upon them, laid upon us, in fact. Let's just close off with the final verse here. He gave order to his disciples to tell no one that he was God's anointed one. So that's the closing chapter. So there's a final warning here. So although the disciples at this point had grasped the fact that Jesus was God's Messiah, they still had not fully grasped what that remaining truth actually meant for them. They had to have a great deal more discipleship training and teaching. To them, it initially meant something different from what it meant to Jesus. Now, Peter was the first to move beyond that, but the others would need to be discipled beyond that, because they were still thinking in terms of a conquering Messiah, a warrior king, someone who would come and sweep the Romans from Palestine and lead Israel to what I assume they imagined was some sort of political power. And that is why, at this point, Jesus commands them, for now, to remain silent. You see, if at this point they'd gone into the wider world and they'd preached their uninformed, not fully formed ideas so soon, then they probably would have just been responsible for raising another in a long line of tragic rebellions. They might have only produced another outbreak of violence from Rome, and the early church would have been doomed to disaster before it had even fully been birthed. Before they could preach that Jesus was the Messiah, they had to learn what that fully meant when it said he was the Messiah. And this is the point of fact that Jesus now will begin to open their eyes that the fact for him, the fact of his messiahship, could mean nothing other than the way of the cross. He will soon tell them that he must go to Jerusalem, and he will soon tell them that he will need to suffer at the hands of the elders and the chief priests and the scribes. Now, it's interesting that three groups of men were the three groups of men who composed the Sanhedrin. The elders were the respected men of the people, the chief priests were predominantly the Sadducees, and the scribes were the Pharisees. So in effect, Jesus is saying, look, what you need to learn is that he is going to have to suffer for the sins of the world. He's going to suffer at the hands of the very leaders of the orthodox religious community out of which he had arisen. Wow, what a sobering thought that is for all of us who wish to walk the same path in life as Jesus Christ did.